There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing your body is breaking down while the medical system insists you are completely healthy. That is the exact tension at the center of a recent post by Kristen from My Adrenal Life. She brings up this Newsweek article by Alice Collins about a woman named Janet Peets. The whole thing starts with skin tags, just skin tags, and it spirals into this massive conversation about the gap between lab results and lived experience.
That gap is where so many people practically live. They set up camp in that space between "your labs are fine" and "I cannot get out of bed." The skin tag detail is actually brilliant because it is so incredibly mundane. Most of us have them or know someone who has them, and we write them off as friction, just clothing rubbing against the neck or underarms. But Kristen points out that in Janet's case, they were clustering, and that clustering is a known clinical marker. The American Academy of Dermatology Association even notes that while they are generally harmless, people with diabetes or metabolic syndrome are highly susceptible to them. But if you walk into a standard 15-minute primary care visit with a cluster of skin tags, the doctor's not necessarily looking at your metabolic engine. They are looking at a cosmetic nuisance. And so Janet spent 5 years, according to that Newsweek piece, being told her blood work was perfectly normal.
5 years of her body screaming that something was fundamentally shifting, while the paper trails said she was the picture of health.
5 years is a terrifying amount of time to be alone with your own physiological decline. That is half a decade of quiet self-doubt.
Exactly. And it builds. It is not just the physical symptoms compounding, the weird energy drops, the cravings, the weight fluctuations that do not match your diet. It is the psychological weight of being the only one who believes something is wrong. You start to ask yourself the questions the doctors are implicitly asking you. Am I just stressed? Is this what getting older feels like? Am I just not handling life as well as everyone else? But what Kristen does in her post is she takes the story of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction and she overlays it onto the adrenal insufficiency community because the mechanism of dismissal is identical. Someone with adrenal insufficiency, whether primary, secondary, tertiary, or steroid-induced, can have these wildly fluctuating symptoms: brain fog, shakiness, complete energy crashes, and they get the exact same speech. Everything looks normal.
Because the labs are a snapshot. They capture one single second of a highly dynamic system.
Right, a single frame of a feature-length film. Cortisol is not a static number. It is pulsatile. It follows a diurnal rhythm, peaking in the morning and tapering off at night. Blood glucose and insulin are constantly shifting in response to food, stress, movement, even ambient temperature. So you go to the lab at 9 a.m., you get your blood drawn, the numbers fall within the reference range, and the case is closed. But what the lab does not see is the crash at 2 p.m. where you can barely hold your head up, or the profound weakness after a minor stressor. And what Kristen is arguing, and what Janet Peets finally figured out, is that you have to start looking at the body as a system rather than isolated data points. Janet stopped reacting to individual symptoms and started tracking patterns. She stepped back and looked at the whole board.
Which is exactly why Kristen is pushing the necessity of tracking in adrenal insufficiency. Tracking symptoms, tracking meds, tracking food. You have to become your own data analyst.
You really do, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And actually, the data on this is staggering when you look at the diagnostic delay in rare diseases, and adrenal insufficiency often falls into this category, or at least shares the same systemic hurdles. The numbers are grim. A recent Rare Barometer survey of over 6,000 patients in Europe found that the average time from the first onset of symptoms to a confirmed rare disease diagnosis is 4.7 years. And 25% of those patients consulted 8 or more different healthcare professionals before they got an answer. 8 different doctors. That is a structural failure. That is not one bad physician missing a clue.
It is entirely structural. The survey showed that 60% of these individuals were initially misdiagnosed with a different physical disease, and another 60% were misdiagnosed with a psychological condition or had their symptoms dismissed completely. So when Kristen talks about this gap between lab results and real life, she is describing a systemic reality for millions of people. You are sitting in an examination room trying to explain that your body is failing, and the person across from you is looking at a piece of paper that says you are fine. And the tragedy is that the piece of paper wins almost every time, unless the patient decides to override the paper with their own meticulously gathered data.
I want to pause on that 4.7 years figure. Because what happens in that window? The disease does not just wait patiently for the paperwork to catch up. It progresses.
It progresses and the collateral damage accumulates. Think about the metabolic overlap Kristen highlights. In adrenal insufficiency, you have low or absent cortisol. Now, we constantly hear cortisol described as the stress hormone, which is true, but it is a massive oversimplification. Cortisol is a primary metabolic driver. It maintains blood sugar between meals. It triggers gluconeogenesis in the liver, which is how your body makes new glucose when you are fasting or stressed. If you lack cortisol, you struggle to maintain stable blood glucose. You get hypoglycemia, shakiness, weakness. Now look at insulin resistance, which is what Janet Peets had. In insulin resistance, you have plenty of insulin, but the cells are essentially deaf to it. Glucose stays elevated in the bloodstream. The body pumps out even more insulin to force the doors open, and you end up with these massive blood sugar swings, fatigue after eating, and carbohydrate cravings.
The mechanisms are opposites, but the lived experience is identical. The crashes, the brain fog, the energy instability.
Exactly. The terrain feels the same to the person walking it. And this is where the diagnostic delay becomes so dangerous. If a doctor sees someone complaining of fatigue, weight changes, and brain fog, and they run a basic metabolic panel that looks somewhat okay, they might just say, eat less, move more. They miss the underlying mechanism. And for someone with adrenal insufficiency, missing that mechanism can be life-threatening. An adrenal crisis is an acute, catastrophic event. Roughly 6 to 8% of people with adrenal insufficiency experience an adrenal crisis every year. It involves hypovolemic shock, severe hypotension, and it can be fatal. So spending 4.7 years in diagnostic limbo is not just an inconvenience, it is playing Russian roulette with your endocrine system.
I don't know, that feels a little too clean to me, the idea that doctors are just blindly missing these massive metabolic red flags. If someone is heading toward hypovolemic shock, surely the labs are showing something abnormal before they hit the floor.
Actually, no. That is the terrifying part. They often do not. Or rather, they do not show abnormalities on the specific, narrow tests that are run during a standard checkup. If you do not specifically order an early morning cortisol test or an ACTH stimulation test, you are not going to see adrenal insufficiency on a standard complete blood count. You might see slightly low sodium or slightly high potassium, but those are easily written off as dehydration or a dietary quirk. The labs are only as good as the questions the doctor is asking. If the doctor is not asking, could this be an endocrine failure, the lab report is not going to spontaneously offer that answer. And this goes back to Kristen's point about overlapping comorbidities. Let's say a patient actually has both. Let's say they have adrenal insufficiency and they developed insulin resistance. The symptoms just become this tangled knot.
And the treatment for one can actively trigger the other, which is a nightmare, a complete nightmare, because the gold standard treatment for adrenal insufficiency is glucocorticoid replacement.
you have to replace the cortisol your body isn't making. You take hydrocortisone or prednisone, but what do chronic exogenous glucocorticoids do? They induce insulin resistance. The research on this is incredibly well documented. Glucocorticoids reduce insulin-stimulated glucose uptake in muscle and adipose tissue. They inhibit the translocation of GLUT4 transporters to the cell membrane.
So basically, the medication keeping you alive and preventing an adrenal crisis is simultaneously making your cells deaf to insulin. So by saving the adrenal system, you are structurally compromising the metabolic system.
Yes, it is a physiological trade-off. Glucocorticoids also stimulate the expression of genes involved in gluconeogenesis in the liver, meaning your liver starts pumping out more glucose, contributing to hyperglycemia, and it alters insulin signaling pathways, downregulating key proteins. So the patient takes their life-saving steroid, their blood sugar spikes, their insulin resistance deepens, and they start developing the exact symptoms Janet Peets had: the skin tags, the weight changes, the profound fatigue. But because they have adrenal insufficiency, they might just think, oh, my AI is acting up, I need more steroids, which then pours gasoline on the insulin resistance fire. This is why Kristen is practically begging people in the My Adrenal Life community to track their data. You cannot untangle that knot without a highly detailed map.
But wait, does that actually hold for the average patient? Because telling someone who is already exhausted, already dealing with brain fog, that they now have to maintain a spreadsheet of every pill, every meal, and every symptom, doesn't that just invite an obsessive relationship with the illness? It feels like we're asking patients to become full-time medical administrators.
I hear you, but I keep getting stuck on the alternative. What is the alternative? The alternative is the 4.7-year delay. The alternative is the 60% misdiagnosis rate. Yes, tracking can feel obsessive. It can be exhausting. But there is a massive difference between tracking out of health anxiety and tracking out of investigative necessity. Kristen specifically says in her post, not in a reactive or fear-based way, but in a more intentional, structured way. The medical system currently does not have the bandwidth to observe you continuously. A doctor gets 15 minutes every 6 months. They see a single dot. The patient is the only one who can draw the line connecting the dots. If you feel shaky at 3 p.m. every day and you track it, you might realize it happens exactly 4 hours after your morning hydrocortisone dose. That is actionable data. That means you are metabolizing the drug too fast and need a split dose. A doctor cannot guess that without the patient bringing the pattern to the table.
So the tracking is the bridge over the gap between the lab result and the lived reality.
Exactly, because the lab result is a fixed metric, and the lived reality is a moving target. And there is another layer to this, which is the sheer prevalence of comorbidities in the adrenal insufficiency population. A recent study analyzing patient cohorts with chronic adrenal insufficiency compared them to the general population. They found that patients with secondary adrenal insufficiency had significantly higher odds of developing type 2 diabetes, a 2.5 times higher risk. They also had significantly higher rates of hypertension and obesity. Now, this is crucial. The study noted that the number of hospitalizations was significantly higher in AI patients compared to controls. That reflects an increased susceptibility to concomitant diseases. Your body is already operating without its main shock absorber. Every other system has to compensate.
Which explains why the symptoms overlap so aggressively. If the adrenal system is down, the thyroid might downregulate to conserve energy. The pancreas is fighting a losing battle against the exogenous steroids. And the patient is just sitting there feeling like they're made of lead.
Right. And then they go to the doctor, and the doctor looks at a single fasting glucose number or a single TSH level and says, normal. That word, normal, can be the most violent word in the medical dictionary when you are chronically ill because it invalidates your reality. It tells you that the suffering you are experiencing is either imaginary or irrelevant. Kristen writes about this so beautifully. She talks about how that quiet self-doubt builds over time. You ask yourself, do I need to push through it? And the danger for someone with adrenal insufficiency is that pushing through it is the exact mechanism that triggers a crisis. If you push through the fatigue, your body demands cortisol it cannot produce. Your blood pressure tanks, and you end up in the emergency room.
There is something genuinely unsettling about realizing that the medical framework designed to protect you is the very thing rendering you invisible.
That makes me genuinely uncomfortable, honestly. The idea that the safety net has massive systemic holes woven into it by design. But that is the reality of evidence-based medicine when it relies exclusively on generalized reference ranges. Reference ranges are built on averages. They take thousands of theoretically healthy people, plot their lab values on a bell curve, and chop off the bottom and top 2.5%. If you fall within the middle 95%, you are normal. But optimal function and normal function are completely different things. Your personal optimal cortisol or glucose level might be at the high end of the range, but because of your disease or your medication, you are hovering at the absolute bottom of the normal range. You feel terrible. Your body is starving for energy, but the computer doesn't flag the number in red ink, so the doctor doesn't intervene.
The computer requires a binary, pathological or fine. There is no code for technically in range, but physiologically deteriorating.
There really isn't. And that is why Kristen's advocacy for pattern tracking is so vital. When you track over time, you establish your own baseline. You stop comparing yourself to the population bell curve and start comparing yourself to yourself. If your fasting glucose is usually 80 and over 6 months it creeps up to 98, a doctor will look at 98 and say, under 100, you are fine. But your tracked data shows a 22% increase. It shows a trajectory. It shows an underlying metabolic shift, likely driven by the glucocorticoid therapy or a developing insulin resistance. You catch the cluster of skin tags before it becomes full-blown metabolic syndrome. You catch the afternoon energy crash before it becomes an adrenal crisis. You shift from being a passive recipient of medical opinion to being an active participant in your physiological management.
But that shifts a massive burden of care onto the patient. We are essentially asking chronically ill people to perform uncompensated clinical labor just to survive.
We are. And there is something almost sad about that. It is profoundly unfair. You are already exhausted, your endocrine system is compromised, and now you have to act as your own primary investigator. But the empowerment that comes from understanding your own machinery cannot be overstated. When Janet Pitts figured out the connection between her skin tags and her insulin resistance, it wasn't just a medical victory, it was a reclamation of her sanity. It proved that her body had not been lying to her. The signals were real. The exhaustion was real. The same thing happens in the AI community. When a patient tracks their symptoms and realizes they need an extra 5 milligrams of hydrocortisone before a stressful event, and they take it and they don't crash, that is a revelation. They realize they have levers they can pull.
They locate the control.
Exactly. They find the control panel. And that is what the My Adrenal Life post is ultimately about. It is a call to engagement. Kristen says she stopped ignoring consistent signals. She stayed curious. She kept asking questions until the pieces made sense together. It is not about rejecting medicine. It is about demanding that medicine look at the whole picture. It is about walking into the doctor's office not with a vague complaint of fatigue, but with a highly specific pattern of data. I experience a severe hypoglycemic episode at 4 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday after physical therapy. My morning hydrocortisone is worn off, and my body cannot maintain glucose levels during the exertion. A doctor can work with that. A doctor can adjust a dose based on that, but they cannot adjust a dose based on I'm tired all the time and my labs from 3 months ago look fine.
The specificity forces the engagement. You corner the system with its own language.
You do. You speak the language of data back to the system, but you contextualize it with your lived experience. And you have to, because the stakes are too high. In adrenal insufficiency, the margin for error is razor thin. If you misinterpret a symptom of low cortisol as just a bad day, and you don't stress dose, you can find yourself in the back of an ambulance. If you misinterpret the metabolic side effects of your steroids as inevitable weight gain and ignore the signs of insulin resistance, you invite a whole host of cardiovascular complications down the line. Studies on the long-term morbidity of adrenal insufficiency point to an increased cardiovascular risk, which makes absolute sense when you factor in the metabolic toll of chronic glucocorticoid exposure. You are threading a needle every single day, trying to replace enough cortisol to keep you alive without taking so much that you induce diabetes.
Which requires a level of awareness most people never even brush up against.
Right. As Kristen wrote, it requires an awareness that it's not something to dismiss, but something to respect. You learn your patterns. You learn your limits. And if you're listening to this and you've been told your labs are fine while your body is falling apart, you need to know that your experience is valid. Your health is not a single data point on a Tuesday morning. It is the entire pattern of your life. The skin tags, the crashes, the cravings, they're all data. Do not let the quiet self-doubt win. Start tracking. Start connecting the dots. And if the person in the white coat won't look at the picture you drew, find someone who will.
The pattern is the reality. The lab is just a glimpse of it. That is a completely different way to orient yourself inside the medical system. It moves you from waiting for an answer to building the answer yourself piece by piece.
And there is real power in that construction. You stop being the subject of the diagnosis and become the architect of your own care. Kristen and the whole My Adrenal Life community are doing incredible work, just validating that reality for people who have been gaslit by their own normal test results.
Which is exactly why conversations like this need space to breathe. If this sparked something for you, or if you know someone navigating that maddening space between normal labs and chronic symptoms, send this their way. Go check out the My Adrenal Life Facebook group to get involved in the conversation.